Good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Cave, and welcome to the last in the series about Britain's role in and relationship to the Holocaust. We've covered the story of Britain's liberation of Belsen in 1945. We've talked about the British Church responses to the Holocaust and its actions and behaviours before and afterwards. And today we're looking, I suppose, more at Britain as a nation. And our memory of Britain's stance on the Holocaust in the 1930s when it was impending, and the 1940s, but also our national memory of it today. It's not all good, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to talk about it. When Israel is in the news, anti-Jewish racism goes up. Holocaust distortion and belittlement, therefore, goes up. And that's why we have to talk about these things. So whilst there'll be no upsetting camp images in this programme this evening, some of the discussion may provoke you, but I think that's good. Hugo Rifkin wrote in the Times this week that the attempt to promote history that celebrates only our successes ignores the equally fascinating account of our failures. So I'd like to add to that this is not about shaming. This is about embracing our warts and all and learning from it, because it does shape the discourse today without certain sections of our population even knowing about it. So this is truly an educational purpose. And as such, I'm delighted to welcome some very important and influential guests in this terrain to explore it. First of all, can I introduce Paul Salmons? Hello, Paul. One of the world's leading Holocaust curators and educators. He helped create the original Holocaust Exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, co-founded the Centre for Holocaust Education at UCL in London, which is regularly ranked #1 for research globally. And he's played a leading role in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And recently he co-curated a stunning exhibition, the Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away exhibition, which won a Grand Prix at the Europa Nostra 2020 awards. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Mark. Lovely speaking.
Next up, the Right Honourable Lord Eric Pickles. Good evening. Eric is the UK Special Envoy for Post-Holocaust issues. He works closely with the wide range of Holocaust academics, survivors and educational and social organisations in the UK. And along with former Labour Cabinet Minister Ed Balls, he co-chairs the United Kingdom's Holocaust Memorial Foundation, helping it to develop international partnerships that can support the new learning centre to be established in London. And he was made a life peer in 2008. Good evening.
Very good evening to you.
And last and by no means least, Rachel, Dr. Rachel Sentry, Head of Research at the UK's Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. Hi, Rachel. She oversees all of HMDT's education function and is also an educator on March of the Living UK. She has an MA in Holocaust Studies from UCL. She's a fellow of the Imperial War Museum in Holocaust Education and has a doctorate in Holocaust Studies from the Royal Holloway, University of London. Her book, based on her PhD research, was published in 2017, which was about the female administrators of the Third Reich. So quite a brainy lot of people I have in front of me who are going to make me look extremely stupid. Just to say to you watching out there, welcome to you too. And if there's any questions that you'd like to submit to any of my guests, you can do so through the YouTube chat function, and we'll pick them up and try to answer at least a few of them at the end, time permitting. So then, there's some meaty stuff to talk about here. And I thought that we'd start with you, Paul, if we may, and just ask you to set the scene, I suppose, in the broadest sense of how do we in Britain remember the Holocaust, and how do our memories of World War II frame and shape it?
Well, thank you, Mark. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. I think I'd like to start with the notion of history itself, which, despite the fact that people like to say just tell the facts of the past, actually I would say history is always intensely political. The stories that we tell and how we choose to tell them say much about ourselves and our identities, and all countries, all peoples have their foundational myths, the stories that they like to tell themselves about who they are, And for the British people, for decades now, much of those foundational myths have been rooted in our memories of the Second World War. So a lot of the ways that we've remembered that past have been framed by the notion, the myth, if you like, of Britain standing alone. In 1940, after the fall of France, Britain, of course, was supported by a vast empire and commonwealth, and yet this myth of standing alone is somehow ingrained in our national consciousness. Also, the myths of the Blitz spirit and of Dunkirk, of Churchill's speeches, of the Normandy beaches. And when I use the term myth, I don't, of course, mean that these things didn't happen or that they're not important and significant, but rather these are the aspects of our past that we draw upon to inculcate and induct our young people, our next generations in our culture, in our values, in our ways of thinking. So the Holocaust has become something which has erupted into the popular memory in more recent decades. And I think there's a challenge then as to where that fits. How do we fit the Holocaust into our national story? One of the ways that we've done that has been through the notion of Britain as liberator. And I think it would be worth us having a look at, we have a short clip of Gunnar Illingworth standing in Bergen-Belsen in April of 1945, having encountered these most horrific scenes and reflecting on what that means for him in terms of why of the Second World War and of Britain's role in it. So perhaps we can have a quick look at that.
Adam. Today is the 24th of April, 1945. My name is Gunnar Illingworth and I live at Cheshire. I'm at present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS men. The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictures in the paper cannot describe it at all. The things they have committed, well, nobody would think they were human at all. We actually know now what has been going on in these camps. I know personally what I am fighting for.
So it seems to me that this notion of I know what I'm fighting for has helped to sort of sum up in a way much of the way that Britain has related to the Holocaust in many of the decades since. This is a notion which allows us to frame the Holocaust in the context of a just war, of a good war, one which is fought for the liberation of the peoples of Europe, and the scenes of the encountered concentration camps are a kind of stark image of the brutality and the barbarity of the Nazis and of their crimes. So in fighting this war, we're able to tell ourselves that we're also fighting for a better world, and it restores, in some sense, hope for a better and a brighter future once the Axis powers were defeated. So I think what we end with this kind of image of the Holocaust within our national story is one which is rather redemptive. But I'd like to question whether or not we should emerge from an encounter with this horrific past with such a redemptive and uplifting message, or whether there's a more troubling kind of way of also thinking about this history. And so if we go also to someone who was there in Belsen in 1945, but now a Jewish survivor of the camps, years later, reflecting on the meaning that she found in the moment of liberation. Let's see what she had to say.
מרים עקביה הייתה בת 11 כאשר הגרמנים נכנסו לקרקוב. מהגטו היא נשלחה למחנה הריכוז פלשוב ומשם לאושוויץ. השתתפה בצעדת המוות ושוחררה על ידי הבריטים בברגן-בלזן.
פקחתי חצי עין וראיתי אנשים עם מסכות גס, והיו בריטים שהגיעו לאותו מקום עם מסכות גס, ומי שהיה לו כוח הריע לכם. והמחשבה הראשונה שככה חלפה את המוח שלי הייתה שחבל, שאיחרו. שיכרו שבלאו הכי כבר לא ניתן להציל. כל העולם אבוד, הרוס, כל העולם שראוי להיקרא עולם הלך. ואני גם אומרת ללכת, אבל לא, זו לא היה חבל על זה שאני הרגשתי את עצמי כמעומדת גם למות. אבל היה חבל, הייתה איזו תחושה שחבל שיחרו, לא בגללי, חבל שיחרו בשביל העולם.
Now, Miriam Akavia gives us a radically more difficult understanding of the Holocaust, right? This is now not a moral fable of good triumphing over evil, but rather the stain which the Holocaust leaves on our very view of humankind, of the world that we've created and the world that we inhabit. So my question in terms of British memory of the Holocaust is, how do we incorporate that kind of story into the story which we tell ourselves about ourselves?
Well, that's quite a heavy start, Paul, but points very well made. But I suppose it doesn't just end, does it, with the side-by-side comparison of the factual events and testimonies. Is there a sense here of how this relates to some kind of desire in popular culture, I suppose, in Britain, for more universal and consoling narratives? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I think that's absolutely right. That there are ways in which we try, in a sense, to domesticate the Holocaust and its and to fit within our existing frameworks, rather than to really deeply reflect as on the notions of what this means for our societies and the way that we live. In the sense that the Holocaust, of course, is first and foremost a disaster for its victims, but I would say it's also a catastrophe for our view of what we think of as Western civilization. How and why was this possible? How was it possible that people everywhere across occupied Europe were complicit in the murder of their neighbours? What does that have to say for us? And I think that's such a difficult question to answer that we tend sometimes to a situation actually more of avoidance. So if I can give you an example, each day when I was working at UCL, University College London, I would walk through the British Library as a shortcut on my way to the office. And I think we have an image here of the Anne Frank tree, which commemorates Anne Frank, of course, but also on the plaque that's dedicated there, it speaks to all the children who died in wars and conflicts this century. A universal message, but a deeply problematic one in my view, in the sense that Anne Frank didn't die in conflict or in war. She was a victim of a genocide where all Jews everywhere were targeted for murder. There's another tree close by in a square not far from the British Library, which is dedicated to all the victims of Hiroshima. And why not? I mean, this is an important thing to remember and to place significance upon. My interest is, why not have a tree which is dedicated to the children who died in the Holocaust, or even the children who died in genocide? But this broader kind of universalization might speak to the kind of lessons we would like to learn, but somehow avoid some of the issues connected with the Holocaust itself.
Well, I might just add that my personal view is that Anne Frank has been iconicized to the point of actually bearing little relation to her real self. Eva Schloss, who we're very close to up at the museum, her stepsister, of course, said she was nothing like, she wasn't all knowing. She was a flirty, 14-year-old, didn't know everything she was made out to be. And I think most troublingly, which is basically what you're saying, her Jewishness has been removed from the modern day, whatever the noun is, of iconology. So yeah, I'm agreeing with you.
Indeed, I mean, there are other examples in our popular culture of that kind of de-Judaization of the past. If we think about some of the most popular representations of the Holocaust in our popular culture, not British produced, but ones which are very popular in British society, we might think, for instance, of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, a hugely popular novel, and then a very successful Hollywood film. The troubling aspect for me of The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, deeply troubling, is the way in which the young Jewish boy, Shmuel, really acts just as a kind of literary device to get the little non-Jewish German boy, Bruno, behind the wire into the camp, and ultimately, of course, in this so-called moral fable, into the gas chambers. The problem with that, I think, in the way that the film, for instance, ends with this dramatic scene of the rain, the storm clouds gathering, the rain beating down, the parents trying to rescue their child when they realize that he's on his way into the gas chambers. Had they, in the film, arrived there in time, of course they would have saved their son, they would have rescued Bruno, but Shmuel would still have gone into the gas chambers, right? And so this notion somehow of it's a strange kind of tragic image that Bruno shouldn't be there, but none of the people should be there. Shmuel shouldn't be there, right? None of the Jewish people should be in that situation. But in this kind of fantasy, we managed to invert the victims so that our main protagonists are non-Jews. And it seems to me that we almost want our Holocaust without Jews in it, in order for it to become a successful, popular kind of representation of this past. We see it again in Sophie's Choice. Extremely powerful film, very well made film, one which deeply moved me when I saw it as a teenager. When I returned to it as an adult, when I was working now in this field, I'd misremembered Sophie's Choice, and in my imagination, she was Jewish. But of course she's not. She's a Polish Catholic. And a deliberate choice because William Styron, wanted to emphasize the universal aspect of Auschwitz and deliberately didn't make her Jewish, despite the fact that, of course, although there were many victims in Auschwitz of different groups, actually 90% of those that were murdered there were Jews. And for this particular choice to take place on the ramp, the way in terms of the selection which happens in Birkenau, that was something that happened to Jews. And yet this de-Judaization, potentially, I guess, to make this somehow a more popular representation for a wider audience.
Interestingly, Paul, you've got in that picture the British Royal production of it. So, to me, that what that says is that it's not so much, never mind the authorial intent, it's the popularity of these representations, so successful with Sophie's Choice that the British wanted to make a stage play about it. And again, with Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, who knows? I certainly don't know what John Boyne had in mind. What I do know is that it's been lapped up by the British public at large. So it's what that says about us collectively as a nation, I guess, is your point.
Sure.
Okay. Well, all interesting stuff. I suppose then it's like to bring in Lord Pickles and Rachel about really moving towards how we can try and remember the Holocaust more honestly, I suppose. Even with, it's fine to have fiction if it's like Striped Pyjamas, if it's clearly put across as fiction. So I suppose if I could start with you, Lord Pickles, you're the UK's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues. What does that job entail?
Yeah, I'll happily say something, but I just want to say something about fiction. I think fiction needs to be very careful because, in a way, it's a kind of a Holocaust distortion. We had a Netflix series on starring Al Pacino. And it depicted things that happened there. The Holocaust was bad enough, but making things up actually, I think, cheapens it. Okay, my role as post-Holocaust envoy. I've got two principal bodies that I'm responsible for. The first one is IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and I brought back the new definition on anti-Semitism from our meeting in Romania. It was the second meeting I attended, played a part in getting adopted, brought it to the newly elected Theresa May, and got Britain to adopt it. Through IRA, I'm involved with my opposite numbers in different countries. So I work very closely with America, with Germany, with the Netherlands, and obviously with Israel. I mean, this summer we'll be facing a big dilemma because it's the anniversary of the invasion by the Soviet Union of the Baltic states, part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A lot of the people who fought the Soviets, made alliance with the Nazis, were actively involved in the Shoah, were actively personally involved in murdering Jews, and we have to ensure that when that happens, that the truth about some of these national heroes is heard and heard loudly. We had a similar problem in Hungary not so long ago about wanting to put up statues to people who were who've been involved in the Jewish laws. Second thing is I'm involved with the International Tracing Service, now called the Alton Archive. It's the largest archive of the Holocaust anywhere in the world. Meticulous records, and even now we are reuniting. We are reuniting families together who've been separated by the Holocaust. Also involved in restitution of property and personal property. Might be sometimes paintings, but sometimes it might be just a simple book with a name inside, and that's the only record that exists that a person actually was alive, and obviously very much involved in the kind of the coalition against Holocaust distortion.
Well, that's the point that I think is the most interesting one, if I interject. I mean, you mentioned Hungary. There's that notorious incident recently of the statue being put up in the central square in Budapest, which reimagines Hungary as being a victim only. When you're dealing with your opposite numbers in these countries, do these things get discussed?
They do get discussed, and I mean, Hungary was a point in question. And there've been similar moves in Poland. IRA needs to ensure that we remember accurately.
Yeah.
And there is a degree of revisionism going on, where people only see themselves as victims.
Yeah.
And of course, we should remember all those Gentiles, sort of among the nations who saved Jews. Absolutely. They did a fantastic job. But they weren't the norm.
No.
They were unusual. Most people just looked the other way. Some participated. And unless we understand that, then I think there's a problem. You see, the thing is, everybody could imagine themselves as a victim of the Holocaust, but few people can imagine themselves as perpetrators. And what the Holocaust must tell us is, everybody is capable of being a perpetrator. We know that from our experience in the Channel Islands. There's nothing particularly continental about the experience of working with Nazis. We need to kind of understand that, and that's why it's very important. I mean, our late friend David Cesarani, I think, put it really well. British experience of the Holocaust is something that, for the most part, we should be proud of, but there were episodes, there were incidents at which we should feel deep shame, and I'm sure we'll come on to those.
Well, I think we probably will, but I would, for my own sake, repeat that I'm not sure. Sometimes, shame can be constructive, and sometimes actually no use whatsoever. And I think there's a lot of shaming of British history that goes on, and I'm not sure what the point is, other than people venting their spleen destructively, and it seems to split people rather than bring them together. Yeah,
but I think it is important that we should be honest. For example, when Jeremy Hunt was Foreign Secretary, I think against the advice of officials, he made a formal apology for the white paper in the 1930s that prevented Jews going into what was then Palestine.
Did he?
I rest my case. I rest my case. I mean, I don't think officials wanted to admit the mistake, but he made it publicly, and I'll happily send you the text.
I'd love to see
But
it.
I think that's important. You can't move on unless you're recognised.
Oh, no, I totally agree. I'm just saying that shaming, the idea of shame, I'm ashamed of, well, you can't be ashamed of something it was a different generation or 9. I mean, so honesty, absolutely. But then, and I think also being honest about how it affects the discourse today. But as you say, we'll come on to that in a minute. Rachel, so, Holocaust Memorial Day, it's your bag, and all the thousands of events around the year that spin off of that, which you organise so well, all of you and your team and Olivia and everybody. How do you see Holocaust Memorial Day as it's run, as it's done in the UK? Does that fit with what Lord Pickles has been saying about Britain as a post-Holocaust thing, or not?
So firstly, I'd just like to thank you, Mark, and the National Holocaust Centre for hosting the webinar and for inviting me to speak this evening. And I particularly want to thank you because you're asking these provocative questions, which are thought-provoking. And I think it's really important to challenge ourselves and to check ourselves and have this space and opportunity to consider the questions. So a little bit of background. Britain has chosen to establish Holocaust Memorial Day. This came out of the Stockholm Conference, which took place in the year 2000, when 46 different governments from around the world all met to discuss Holocaust education, remembrance and research. And at the end of this meeting, all of the countries signed a declaration committing themselves to preserving the memory of those who were murdered in the Holocaust. Now, each country is responsible for commemorating it in their own way. And in the UK, the government chose to do this in the form of Holocaust Memorial Day, which takes place each year on the 27th of January. Initially, the government ran the day themselves, but in 2005, they set up the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, who I work for. Now, we endeavour to make Holocaust commemoration meaningful, and we also aim to ensure that the commemoration goes hand in hand with education. So it's not just remembering, but it's also learning. We do that in 2 ways. Firstly, we have a high-profile national ceremony to which faith leaders, dignitaries, members of parliament, survivors are invited. But we also, as you mentioned, support and encourage local activities all around the country to take place. And we hope that these bring communities together to remember and learn from the past. And that model of local activities is not practiced by the other countries that mark Holocaust Memorial Day, but we felt it's really important because it ensures the day has lots of reach and impact. The ceremony itself this year was broadcast live, so we were able to reach lots more people and hopefully spread the reach and the impact. Now, the questions that you're asking is, are we, HMDT, romanticising the Holocaust? Are we skewing what we present to the public and in a way what we ask them to remember? Now, Paul started this evening by talking about history. I think it's also really important to talk about memory. What exactly are we remembering? Now, one thing that's really interesting to me, hopefully to all of you as well, is that except for the survivors of the Holocaust, and maybe a few others, such as those who liberated the camps, we in Britain, don't have a personal memory of the Holocaust. It's not our memory that we're sharing and remembering. And instead, we are acquiring a memory. We're developing a collective way of remembering. And therefore, in a way, necessarily, we're picking and choosing what we want to remember. Memory itself is subjective. So what we at HMDT try to do is to convey the context, the facts. We try to ensure that everything we do is grounded in historical accuracy. We want people to learn from the past, not just remember it. And something really interesting, we've talked about fiction quite a lot. And one of the challenges is that some people may use fiction as a way of learning about the past, but unfortunately, the fiction isn't necessarily grounded in historical fact, as Paul alluded to with the boy in the striped pajamas. So I think that's why for us it's really important. The other element of the romanticized story that HMDT is very aware of is the element of survival. Now, often we focus on the survivors who came to the UK and what happened to them afterwards. And perhaps in a way, this is a natural tendency because we want to be on the winning side, or we want an uplifting story, look at these stories of survival. But the truth is it's an anomaly. We know that 2/3 of European Jewry did not survive. So at HMDT, whenever we produce resources, we try to make sure we don't just tell the stories of survivors, but we include the stories of those who were murdered, those who aren't around, whose offspring are not around to tell their stories, so that they're not forgotten. And another example of that is the Kindertransport, which I think is something in Britain that we, talk about a lot because we present ourselves as the rescuers, the heroes in that story. And I know Paul's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But for HMDT, we also try and include the fact that their parents were often left behind. Often they were murdered and not able to come over. So we make sure that we share a bit more context, a bit more depth, if you like. HMD, Holocaust Memorial Day, is just one day, and sometimes it is just one activity or one event. So we try our best to offer opportunities for activity organisers to mark other genocides throughout the year, and also for them to go beyond one event. So a teacher to do a series of lessons, for example. But we do know that there are limitations. And that's why, first of all, I welcome this opportunity today. I'm hoping that I will learn something maybe we can take away for our resources. But also we welcome things such as the UK HMF's proposals, which I know we're going to come on to as well, which, we want more people to be discussing Britain's role in the Holocaust. And just to conclude, I think the focus should be on the purpose of memorialisation. So at HMDT, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, we want people to learn, to feel, and as a result, to do something. We don't want people, as you say, Mark, to be wallowing in guilt or to be shaming previous generations. We want them to be learning more, and it has to be an honest learning. And if we want people to feel something, it has to be meaningful. We know that we at HMDT can't cover everything. There's not enough opportunity to go into the depth just on Britain's role, never mind everything else. But we hope HMD is a starting point, that people will be inspired and moved and go on to learn more. Thank you.
That's you say, it's just a starting point. We can't cover all the bases, I think you said. So then if I could ask a difficult question, I apologize in advance. Why then, it's hard enough getting across the Holocaust. What about all the other genocides that you cover? Is that a wise thing to do?
Yes, of course, it's a wise thing to do.
Tell us why. Give me all the pieces you're trying to get across. I come from the school of better to throw one ball and have the audience catch it than throw 3 or 4 and have them drop the lot.
Well,
how does it help Holocaust memorialization to cover all the genocides?
So we hope that people that are commemorating the Holocaust will also be commemorating and learning about Nazi persecution. And we commemorate 4 genocides, the one that took place in Cambodia, against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the genocide in Bosnia and Darfur. And we, not only that, Mark, but I'm going to add to that, we also want people to think about the contemporary resonance, the contemporary relevance, and what's happening in the world today. I think it's really important to show that the Holocaust isn't just one isolated incident of genocide. We want people to remember those who were murdered for being Jewish, but we also want them to learn about the other genocides, which were all examples of identity-based persecution. In each of these cases, people were targeted because of who they were. And we hope that by looking at all of these, and at an HMD event, people don't need to look at all of them. They can start with the Holocaust as the centre point of their event and then try and include 1 or 2 others, or all of them, depending on the time and the space. But we hope that they'll learn. And I think Lord Pickles made a really good point. People see themselves as the victim or perhaps as a rescuer, but they never think of themselves as the perpetrator. But we show that time and time again in history, different people are perpetrators from different backgrounds, different countries, different faiths. Anybody could be a perpetrator, and unfortunately have been in various examples. And we hope that people will learn from all of these examples and help us make a better future.
Did anyone have any comment on that, Paul, Lord Pickles?
Well, I think it's a way in which it's possible to look at genocides through the eyes of the Holocaust and look back through those eyes at the Holocaust itself. I think it does make a difference. There are many things that are very similar. I remember seeing the Hutu 10 Commandments about not having any relations with Tutsis and like it. It looked to me very much like it could have come from the pen of Joseph Goebbels. But I think we need to remember that the Holocaust was different from all the other other genocides in its intent. It was
I agree.
the only time a state had used the full panoply of modern mass production to use that to kill and to remove an ethnic group.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with that. I mean, Anita Lasker-Wolfers always says, just as an example about its uniqueness, that this was the only genocide where human beings were recycled, made into lamps and things like that with skin. So I have to say I agree. Let's maybe move it on and talk about specifically, to bring it back to British values, an oft used phrase, certainly in the classrooms that we work with up and down the country, citizenship and British values and what that means, and what the Holocaust says about this country's values. Paul, I know you've got views about this. How does it all fit together in your opinion?
Well, picking up on some of the previous remarks, this issue about not only looking at victims but also trying to understand the perpetrators and to see the potential of our own role in these ways as well. It's also, I think, true to say though that the vast majority of us, thankfully, are never going to become either victims or perpetrators, and yet genocides continue to scar our world, and the role that we do find ourselves in continually is one of onlookers to genocide. And so I think the actual question for us, or the most pressing one, is how do we respond as and when mass atrocities, crimes against humanity and genocides are unfolding. And so not only to look at the Holocaust and other past genocides, but to, as Rachel said, think about the resonance and relevance for our lives today. So if we look at the ways in which our past has been framed in this country, we tend to, I think, like the kinds of stories that we find extremely inspiring and uplifting, such as the powerful, extraordinary story of British banker Nicholas Winton, who led a tireless campaign to rescue children from German-occupied Czechoslovakia on the eve of the outbreak of the Second World War. He saved 669 children, most of them Jewish, and his story rightly has become, I think, a central part of the way in which we've looked at the British role, the British period, and his story was captured in a couple of episodes of the BBC television programme That's Life with Esther Ranson. I think we can show a clip now.
This is his scrapbook. There are all kinds of fascinating pictures in it. Perhaps you can see this is a picture of Nicholas Winton himself with one of the children he rescued, all the letters. But back here is the list of all the children. This is Vera Diamant, now Vera Gissing. We did find her name on his list. Vera Gissing is with us here tonight. Hello, Vera. And I should tell you that you are actually sitting next to Nicholas Winton. Hello.
I wore this around my neck, and this is the actual pass that we were given to come to England, and I'm another of the children that you saved.
Can I ask, is there anyone in our audience tonight who owes their life to Nicholas Winton? If so, could you stand up, please?
Gets me every time, Paul.
Absolutely. It's an incredibly beautiful moment, isn't it? And deeply touching. It's the sort of story which also attaches itself in our collective memory to the story of the Kindertransport that Rachel mentioned before. And we see in this image on the book, The Policeman Smiled, that image of Britain and the British state as a welcoming safe haven for refugees. Almost 10,000 children from Nazi Europe escaping and finding refuge here. And again, it's an important part of the story that we need to tell. But there's another image, also of the British Bobby, if you like, from the same era, which is rather less well known. And that image is one that's taken in March 1939, a couple of weeks after Czechoslovakia had been invaded by Nazi Germany. And here we see at Croydon Airport a Jewish Polish man and a woman, two of a group of 13 refugees from Nazi Europe who are being frog-marched to an aeroplane that will fly them to Czechoslovakia. And here we have a story which is happening at the same time as the stories of the Kindertransport and Nicholas Winton, but one which I think our country has rather less embraced in terms of its collective memory. And so what strikes me and why I think this is important for us today, to have a wider, a kind of more nuanced and a fuller picture of our role in this period, is because, again, we face humanitarian crises around the world today. And it strikes me that in response to the Syrian refugee crisis, where millions were in need, our response numbered in the thousands, 20,000 Syrian refugees allowed here, which is rather similar to the sort of number that we memorialize when we speak about our country as safe haven during the 1930s. Whereas Germany, whose burden in its national memory is actually of 6 million, takes 1 million refugees. And it just makes me wonder how far these stories of, these really uplifting stories, how far do they really inspire us to further action? And how far do we try and match up to these stories of people like Nicholas Winton? Or how far do we actually use the stories of the past to make us perhaps feel a little bit more complacent about our country and our role today? We can myth make about this notion of being a safe haven and still turn people away, deport them, refuse them entry, to my mind, in rather shameful ways.
Well, I was hoping to be able to have a bit of a chat around that, but I'm a bit conscious of time because we're running a bit behind. I know that you wanted to talk about another example of the British sort of polarity or contradiction, the story of Ludwig Neumann. If you've got time, just maybe to focus on, the real meat of the story.
Sure.
That would be
okay. So Ludwig Neumann, this notion of you asked about British values. So rather quickly, forgive me to run through here. Ludwig Neumann was a German Jewish man who, here we see him in his First World War uniform. He was decorated, fighting for Germany in the trenches of the Great War, after which he became the sole owner of the Neumann and Mendel factory. He'd inherited that from his father, making industrial fabric, clothing factory, which in the 1930s, this Jewish man found himself, of course, a victim of Nazi persecution. And in the 30s, his business was appropriated. We see here images of the office decked out in swastikas. If we just go to the next image, please. And also a plaque on his building when Neumann and Mendel was taken over by a business rival, non-Jewish, of course, Joseph Herbring, who takes over the factory. And we see two letters written by, first of all, Neumann to his previous customers, bidding them farewell, and Joseph Herbring signing off with a Heil Hitler, saying he's now in charge of the business. Critical point for us is this persecution continues. We can see an image of Ludwig Neumann in 1938, still a rather confident, smiling image of this still young man. Shortly after this, and shortly after his business was taken over, he spent several weeks in Dachau, and we see the same man with the violence written all across his face. This sort of desperate situation of Jewish refugees was well known in this country, and there were people who responded extraordinarily generously. So Mrs. Holland, for example, wrote to the British consul, and she also wrote to his mother, Ludwig's mother, Frau Neumann, and his sister, Frau Elkisch, saying, "It will give my husband and myself great pleasure if you will both come to this country as our guests." So when we want to think about, again, British values, this sense of generosity, this lovely sentiment within this letter. And indeed they come, and so does Ludwig. And Ludwig, for a while, is, during the beginning of the Second World War, is interned in the Isle of Man, as were a number of other so-called enemy aliens. You can see an image of him here. And when he was released, a different letter, also from a British person, this one an anonymous note, saying the people who live in Prenton are taxed to keep scum from Europe, whilst English cannot get a house. Aliens through their Roman Catholic Church steal jobs and houses. You want to become British, so do all the Poles who are eating, guzzling food in England. Thieves, murderers. Russia does not have 100,000 aliens living in the country. Everyone hates you. Go to Palestine. Which of these are our British values? Is it the openness, the generosity, the willingness to help those in need that we like to remember, of course? Or is it also the xenophobia, the racism, the hostility that unfortunately, of course, we still also see continuing aspects of our society today? Do we need to do more to kind of confront this aspect of our past also?
Lord Pickles, does any thoughts come to mind about in the teaching of British values in school? I know that the teachers we speak to really struggle to know how to teach it.
I have a strong feeling about British identity, and I firmly believe that Jewish identity is a firm part of British identity. And without Jewish identity, British identity would be less. And that also applies to other communities that make up British identity. I think we can't go wrong in trying to tell the truth. I mean, we saw that very moving thing from Nicholas Winton. We need to remember, of course, that Mr. Winton didn't receive any help from the British government, received no funds from the British government to do it. And then on a very cold day in Belarus, just outside Minsk at Malitetsky, I laid a wreath, because most of the parents of those kindergarten were actually murdered in Belarus, taken by a train from Czechoslovakia through Austria. So we need to be able to tell the truth. There is a kind of duality about what people are capable of doing. And we went back to the question about the perpetrators. The Nazis weren't monsters. They were ordinary, rather dull people who did monstrous things. And I think we need to come to terms with that. And that's partly the problem, is we mustn't always see the Holocaust in black and white terms. We need to understand that nothing was as clear as it appears. And the letter that was just read out by Paul, I mean, one of the worries that the British government had at the time in terms of letting was the level of anti-Semitism within the country and unwillingness to allow people into the country, and an inability to recognize between the victims of Nazi oppression and Nazi sympathizers. So people that were interned in Kent and in the Isle of Man were often Jews were cheek and jowl with Nazis.
Yeah.
So, and while it probably doesn't work all the time, I think it's always a dangerous trap to compare what was happening in the 1930s with contemporary Britain. I think it does mean that we need to understand that we have an obligation. We have an obligation to fight prejudice and to fight bigotry and to ensure that no one in our society is felt persecuted, to turn it. There's things we saw at the weekend. And it was a deliberate attempt to turn the Muslim community against the Jewish community.
Yeah,
it was a deliberate attempt to take sides. That's one of the hardest things that any government has to do, which is to work hard for social cohesion and to recognise that as citizens we have the right of peace and protection, and to borrow from the Americans, the right for the pursuit of happiness.
That note that Paul showed, the guy in the different generation, as you say, different times, but the kind of street xenophobia is true down the ages and will probably never go. What I was is whether it's Syrians go home today or it's Jews go home then, there's a baseline, I suppose. But the thing that I'm really interested in that note, if we could just put it back on the screen, if someone can do that, is the final word, the final sentence of that note, which to me is slightly different to the usual generic strand of xenophobia, which is, it's not just saying, don't come here, it's go to Palestine. So there's a framing there of Jewish immigrants, Jewish refugees to this country, there's an assumption about where they belong. Now, this, I alluded to it when I introduced the program, there's a kind of a vortex, I suppose, of troubled, difficult British history in its running of the British, the Palestine Mandate after the First World War. And is it not very troubling that at the same time as that vortex of the whole world of pain was going on in the Middle East, that along comes the Holocaust as well? And the link is Jews. And I know, Paul, you have a bit of a view about this, but before you come on to it, there's a couple of quotes I want to show from MPs in a single debate in the Commons in 1942. First is Eleanor Rathbone, wonderful independent MP. You know who she is. Fought a lot for women's rights, but also refugeeism. The only MP in 1933 who spoke up against Hitler when he came to power, and I think died of exhaustion in her efforts to save Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe. But in this one debate, in one summer's day in 1942, she says this, and she's asking the Undersecretary of State for the Colonies, who actually was Macmillan at the time, a young Macmillan on the way up. Can the Undersecretary of State for the Colonies please explain the refusal of the Palestine authorities to permit the landing of 750 Jewish refugees from Romania and Bulgaria on the steamship Struma, who subsequently perished through the sinking of the ship? And will he consider making concessions regarding immigrants to Palestine whose maintenance is guaranteed? There, in a nutshell, you have Britain's, role, Britain having a hand in what's going on with the Holocaust in Nazi Europe and what's going on over in the Middle East. Then the same debate, a fellow MP, Sidney Silverman, Jewish MP, followed on and said, may I add to that, when I asked the honourable gentleman, will he include in his inquiry the question of how the Palestinian administration reconciles its refusal to admit these refugees with the ease with which it has admitted into Palestine the friends and relatives of the Mufti who have acted in opposition to this country? Wow. I don't know what Macmillan's reply was, but this really, for me, gels and concretizes the complexity of Britain's, sort of hydra-headed involvement on the world stage. Paul?
Yes, well, that's reference in the note that I showed to Palestine is a bitter irony there, isn't it? The notion that that Ludwig Neumann doesn't belong here, he belongs there, at a time when the British, of course, under the Mandate, Palestine had control and access to that region, and could have allowed not only Neumann but many thousands of other Jewish refugees to reach safe haven there. And yet the period of British control of the Mandate, I would say, has been was marked by promises and betrayal to both Arabs and Jews in that region. It's rather a shameful part of our history, and I would say that we need to look at the context of the brutality of the British response to the Arab Revolt, 36 to 39, to the White Paper in 1939, severely restricting Jewish emigration to Palestine, and the fact that that continued.
Having, of course, sorry to interrupt, but having, of course, that essentially reneges directly on Balfour's declaration, Balfour's promise to Rothschild in 1917.
Absolutely, and as I say, I mean, broken promises and frustrations on the British on both sides, but I think basically driven by what was perceived to be national self-interest. So when during the Second World War itself, detailed, accurate reports are coming through about mass murder of Jews in Europe, still they hold to that policy of the White Paper, as was seen in the example you just gave, Mark, of the Struma and the refusal to allow refugees there to enter. How does that play out today? It seems to me that even in the post-war era as well, we already looked at our memories of Bergen-Belsen. We looked at Gunnar Illingworth there talking about now I know what I was fighting for. And yet in the immediate post-war era, displaced persons from Belsen and from other parts of Europe desperately trying to find a way to get a new home and to move to Palestine and being held back. And we just saw the image there of the Exodus, the most famous example of these ships. And again, the British not only turning that back, but this becoming a matter of international outrage and outcry. Connected with this, I think also, though, are the kind of confusion amongst many British people. If we fought the war to help these persecuted people of Europe, if in a sense we fought the war to save the Jews, we know we didn't do that, but if that's the kind of myth which is emerging, how then to explain the hostility of Jewish people after the war and this conflict which comes between Jews in the region of Palestine and also in this country, the Irgun, the bombing of King David Hotel. This, I think, causes a great deal of confusion in the minds of the British public and an emerging hostility towards Jewish people and their claims in that region. Ultimately, though, I think what we have is today some sense of British guilt over our policies during that period. And I would say that is perhaps a guilt which gets projected onto people in the region today during that conflict. Sometimes as a way, even these extreme views of identifying Israel as a Nazi state, this kind of depiction, this appropriation of the past, perhaps what it's doing is to somehow negating Britain's responsibility at the time. Somehow Jews are undeserving in this discourse. What I would suggest is that if we have a more full, frank and nuanced conversation about Palestine and Britain's role there in the 30s and 40s as part of our Holocaust memory and Holocaust memorialization education, which I think we've failed to do so far, maybe we'd have a more nuanced and better discourse on that conflict in the present today.
A golden opportunity, I think, for a purported memorial in London, I believe, Lord Pickles. Tell us a bit about then how you think it's going to address all of this.
That will be included. I'm absolutely determined. I mean, with due respect, you made light of the Foreign Secretary apologising for all that. I think the Jewish people deserve to receive that apology. I think there's a strong case to say that had Israel existed, had migration been possible, then a lot of people who died in the Holocaust would not have died, and the world would be a better place for that. I mean, we could go along the Sykes-Picot and all the carving up of the Middle East, but there are things happening in memorialization that we've kind of touched on, which are attempting to rewrite history. So it's massively important for the memorial to tell the truth, to tell the balance, to understand that it can't be just a triumph of the liberation of Belsen. We start with the liberation of Belsen, but we will touch on those debates. Those very quotes that you talked about will be featuring in the exhibition. Yeah. We will look at anti-Semitism. We will look at the way in which, through the kinder transport, we can reunite with all the countries in Europe, where we can take an individual and never lose sight of the 6 million were individuals who had hopes. But I think there is something peculiar about to happen, because when the last survivor is no longer with us, I think at that point history will be reassessed. And we will have an enormous responsibility to ensure that the truth about the Holocaust is heard. I'm less concerned about Holocaust denial. I think that belongs to the nutty fringe. What I am concerned about is Holocaust distortion and Holocaust revision. And we will have singularly failed unless we examine the nature of the Holocaust, because while you rightly point out we have no experience of it, the Holocaust largely framed the last half of the 20th century, and its shadow, along with other genocides, continues to put. And that's why it's so important that it is next to Parliament, not just in terms of here is democracy and a last bastion against tyranny, but to remind those people who work in that building that they have always got a choice. They can either support their people or they can oppress them. And I think that is a very important lesson to learn. I have to say, of course, people who are watching this, that is all subject to planning permission, and we look forward to receiving the inspector's report in due course. But I think it's my intention, and it's certainly the intention of Ed, that this should not be seen in isolation, that we will link up with Yad Vashem, we will link up with the with facilities in Washington and in Auschwitz and in Berlin, to ensure that there is a solid voice to ensure that the truth of the Holocaust is understood. The thing about distortion is they can tell as many lies as they like, it doesn't matter, but we cannot afford for a single exaggeration. We must always be grounded in the truth. Well, I hope you'll link up with us too up at the National Holocaust Museum. You certainly will, as well, because we've been to work together, haven't we? And it's, the reason why I run the place is because I'm forever indebted, frankly, to the Smith family, the world's only non-Jewish founders of a Holocaust place of remembrance and learning. Certainly at the time, I think there's a place in Japan as well. I'm talking about apart from institutions, obviously. And I just think what you're talking about is unbelievably important for today's different demography, shall we call it, from what Britain was composed of back then. So how could we expect those lads that drove down from Bradford and terrorized northwest London Jewish communities? There's just a basic lack of understanding, lack of education, lack of knowledge. And without that, we have a real melting pot for trouble. And that, to me, was a real example of how history affects today. I mean, I'm a former leader of Bradford, so I find it really shocking, particularly as I remember in the last civic disturbance, there was the Muslim community came out to protect a synagogue in Bradford. And yes, I remember. There's some really good relationship. Yeah, there are. And I found, for people to advocate murder and sexual violence on our streets was beyond shocking, and particularly in support of a terrorist organisation. Yeah, indeed. Okay, well, look, we've already gone over time. There's some very powerful stuff. If anyone can bear with us for, have you got another 10 minutes, all of you? Yeah, sure. Great, thank you. Because just in terms of what Britain did actually, just a little quick whistle-stop tour. I think Paul can give us of some very powerful and upsetting facts, and it just calls for reflection, I think. Paul, would you mind just taking us through what you got?
Sure, yeah. Again, I know we are pressed for time, so maybe one of the ways to explore the question of what Britain knew and when, which is a complex, difficult subject, of course. Maybe let's personalize it, and we could perhaps tell this story partly through the story of one man, Shmuel Ziegelboim, a Polish Jew who by 1942 was actually part of the Polish government in exile in London. Ziegelboim was in touch with people in Poland, of course, through couriers. Secret couriers were getting messages out, and he received a report from the Bund, the Jewish Socialist League in Warsaw, from Leon Feiner and others, which he used to publish pamphlets, also this Stop Them Now pamphlet, and also through press conferences. Actually, by June of 1942, there was a rather prominent article in the Daily Telegraph. Germans murder 700,000 Jews in Poland. It talks about traveling gas chambers. It talks about Helmno, and it identifies actual places and numbers of people also shot. And so good, detailed, accurate knowledge right in the middle of the Second World War, and at the critical time in terms of the escalation of the Holocaust, what some have called the so-called Year of Killing, 1942. Good detailed knowledge is already getting out. Now, this, of course, was initially primarily from Jewish sources, and corroborating evidence, such as that of the so-called Regner telegram from the World Jewish Congress in Geneva, also confirming the existence of a plan at the highest levels in the Führer's headquarters, it said, to exterminate millions of Jewish people. This is now the summer of 1942, August of 1942. There was a certain amount of reluctance to base government policy only on these Jewish sources, but by the end of the year, a Polish courier by the name of Jan Karski had brought eyewitness evidence. I think you can see Jan Karski here also. By November of 1942, he was speaking to the British, the American governments, and the Polish government in exile. And not sure, do we have an image of Karski as well? Yeah. And he had been actually smuggled inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Leon Feiner, who I mentioned before, was one of his guides. He had smuggled himself in. He was also taken very close to the Belzec death camp. The fact that he's non-Jewish and an eyewitness lends a great deal of credibility in the eyes of the British and American governments. And the campaign to do something for the British and the American, the Allied governments, to make some form of statement or declaration to change their policy is mounting during this time. He also meets with Shmuel Ziegelboim, and Ziegelboim asked, does he actually have a message for him and other Jewish leaders as well? And he does. He has memorized this message from Leon Feiner, who says, let them, that's being the Jewish leaders, go to all the important English and American offices and agencies. Tell them not to leave until they obtain guarantees that a way has been decided upon to save the Jews. Let them accept no food or drink. Let them die a slow death while the world is looking on. Let them die. This may shake the conscience of the world. Ziegelboim is so agitated when he receives this news. He's already working absolutely tirelessly to get this knowledge out. The continual pressure, there are reports now in the New York Times as well, and later in the British press. All of this mounts and leads in December of 1942 to the statement in the British Parliament. The German authorities are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. Those responsible will face retribution. So we see very clearly that good, accurate knowledge was known. The Allied declaration is made in 1942. And yet the issue remains, well, can anything more be done? Can anything practical be done to rescue Jews? And Eleanor Rathbone was again very important in this campaign. You've mentioned her already, Mark. So is William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury. These campaigns lead to a pressure for a joint conference by the British and the Americans, on the eve of which, in March 43, Temple says on the BBC, Jews are being slaughtered at the rate of tens of thousands a day on many days. So popular knowledge was well known, the dimensions of these crimes. The Bermuda Conference is called for April 1943, and delegates from the British government and the American government meet in Bermuda on the 19th of April. Coincidentally, the 19th of, I think we have an image of them at Bermuda as well. Coincidentally, and alongside this image of Richard Law and Howard Dodds, the British and the American delegates in Bermuda, on the same day, the Nazis enter the Warsaw Ghetto with the intention of finally liquidating it, of murdering the remaining 60,000 or so Jewish people that remain there. And those Jews rose up and fought back. So the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is taking place on exactly the same day that the British and the Americans are meeting to discuss what more can be done to rescue Jewish refugees from Europe. On the next day, on the second day of, if we could go back to the previous image, thank you. On the second day, okay, we're losing ourselves a little bit on these images. On the second day of the conference, Richard Law, the British delegate, says, well, the problem is if we make a proposal to Hitler to rescue, so to take Jewish refugees, the problem is he might agree. And then perhaps we have millions of unwanted persons and we might find ourselves in a very difficult position. So this is the British stance in April 43 in Bermuda. The very next day, an intercept from the ghetto itself, a radio transmission, is intercepted by the Swedish radio. And they hear this message which says, the last 35,000 Jews of Warsaw have been condemned to execution. Warsaw is again echoing to musketry volleys. People are murdered. Women and children defend themselves with their naked arms. This is a cry from the ghetto itself on a secret radio transmission. And it ends with just two words before the intercept is broken off. The words, "Save us." The plea from the ghetto at the time when the British and the Americans are meeting in Bermuda. And what was the outcome in Bermuda? Nothing was done to rescue more Jews. The only discussion remained what to do with 5,000 Jews who had already made it to Spain, which of course were already safe. Of those 5,000, 630 were helped to reach North Africa. So the Bermuda Conference ended without being able to save a single Jewish person. On the other hand, it's been said, it did contribute to the death of one of them. And if we just go back to Shmuel Ziegelboim again, in utter despair at the failure of the Allied governments and his Polish government in exile, he said, to do more to rescue the Jews of Europe, he commits suicide, and by my death, he said, I want to give expression to my most profound protest against the inaction in which the world watches and permits the destruction of the Jewish people. Ziegelboim's death was supposed to shake the conscience of the world. I hope very much that the building of this new memorial alongside the Houses of Parliament is something which not only speaks of the past, but holds our politicians, our governments to account today, as we also witness these ongoing atrocities around the world.
Poignant, powerful stuff. Thank you, Paul. Yeah. The Ziegelboim story is very sad, isn't it? To put it mildly, and of course, just backs up what we were saying before about the people like Rathbone protesting all the way through, before, during, and after there was a full crisis going on. But is it fair, the question I wanted to ask you, Paul, very quickly was: is it fair to say that the Bermuda Conference was in itself a bit of a sham? There was never a bit of a showboating. Was there a real intention to go to that conference and actually do something material? Perhaps Lord Pickles knows as well, or has a view.
I'm sure Lord Pickles will be able to say more. My understanding is Richard Law was a rather junior member. Wasn't high ranking. Wasn't perhaps empowered to make major decisions. The same as Howard Dodds was not really a high level member of the American government either. I mean, later on, of course, the Americans do a lot more than the British with the in terms of rescue efforts. So they actually come out of this history a little better than we do, but still, many would argue not enough. And neither we nor the Americans ever made it a war aim to rescue the Jews of Europe. Again, understandable in a sense why there's a world war taking place and other practical strategies needed to be taken in order to win that war. It can be understandable, but what I think the objection is, in terms of the memory of this period, is if we still frame our role as one of fighting to liberate people and all. We fight, I would argue, we fight any conflict, any war for national, strategic, geopolitical reasons. And I think we should be more honest about that and not rest on past glories where we did accept numbers of refugees, but perhaps confront a more difficult past and wonder how we can do better in the future.
Lord Pickles, any comment?
Well, I think the choice of Bermuda wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't the easiest place to get to during the Second World War. So there was virtually no media cover of it whatsoever. I mean, the big questions that we sometimes are asked of the Allies, the big one is, should we have bombed the railway lines leading up to Auschwitz?
Yeah.
The view of the Allies, and this is their view, this is not my view, the view of the Allies was that we can bring this to the end by defeating Nazi Germany, and we should not divert anything from that. However, I have seen a comment from the ministry, from unnamed officials, and saying, well, even if we did bomb the tracks, there'd still be a lot of killing going on. And what will we do with all these Jews?
Yeah,
which is a pretty shocking thing to say. So that's why it's going to be very important when we deal with the memorial that we just simply tell the truth, as you rightly say. I'm not trying to shame everybody, but we need to understand these were complex decisions. There was no sort of right and wrong. And people arrived at decisions. They thought they were doing the right thing. In the early days, there wasn't a distinction. There wasn't a clearly understanding that this was an attempt against the Jewish, against Jewish people, Jewish race. There was a feeling that this is how the Nazis behaved to everybody. Mm. And it was only, I think, probably about 1941, 1942, the true nature of what was going was understood. People didn't entirely understand what the Einstein group were doing in those early days in Poland. It was only really when things started to move into Belarus that it became much more clearer. Mm. But I mean, I believe that even now that David Cesarani was right. You know, it is mixed. There are a lot of things we should be proud of, but there were incidents and there were episodes which we should feel some degree of shame, even after all this time. It's a mark against our national credibility.
Well, as long as we can learn from it, yeah, that's the point of it. Let me just put a question to each of you from the audience, if we've got time. One question for each of you. So the first question, don't know who it's for, whoever would like to answer actually, is from Philip Jacobs, and Philip Jacobs asked that says that the perpetrators were supported by the bystanders. What can we do about them? I assume he means the bystanders. Maybe that's an education question to Rachel or Paul. Oh, the anticipation is you're.
I'm happy to take it.
People.
I think the issue is I'm not keen on the term bystanders, because we often then frame the notion of we shouldn't be bystanders, we should be upstanders, and I find that kind of simple moralizing to be misplaced. I think the issue actually is the deep and widespread complicity. It's very easy to become complicit in the crimes of the Nazis, and you didn't have to hate anyone to do so. There were people who attended public auctions in order to buy cheaply the looted goods of their neighbours. There were those that worked in the census bureaus that so-called marked people with the so-called race of either Roma and Sinti or Jewish or so-called Aryan. People, through their daily activities, their daily work, became complicit. And I think one of the problems that people faced then, that we still face today, is the way that genocide can operate at a distance, that we can go about our daily lives contributing to gross injustice and to huge suffering, but because we don't see the direct action of the direct result of our actions, we can tell ourselves that we're somehow not so involved. The story of the so-called bystanders or onlookers, or the ordinary people in Europe who became complicit, the reason why that should give us pause, I think, is because through our actions today, we also very easily slip into systems, I think, that perpetuate gross injustice. So I think that's our question. What is it that we do that potentially slides into whether we're buying goods that are cheap because of mass suffering elsewhere in the world, or because
we're disagreeing. Go on.
I love Paul like a brother. I cannot tell you how depressed I am by that response. I think there's a world of difference between choosing the wrong lemon under a democratic country and defying the Nazis. I think bystanders is a perfectly good word, and I think we need to understand their motivation. Some of the people who were bystanders would have been anti-Semitic and would have rather enjoyed what's happened. Some people would have wanted to loot their neighbours' homes. Other people would have said that actually what the Nazis were doing was legal, and it was legal according to Nazi law, and the consequences of defying them would have been horrendous. They would have been killed, and their family would have been killed. So don't ask questions and look away. I kind of understand, and that's why the people who actually did stand out are so terrific. And I think, with oodles of respect to Paul, drawing comparisons between us not being ethical in terms of what we're buying isn't like what it was going to be under the Nazis. The Nazis was a brutalizing regime that spared no one. I think we need to understand why people did look away, and why some people have the courage to do something about it. But I don't think a modern connotation. I just don't think it works. And I say that with lots of love, Paul.
No, I think that's a very fair point, and I don't want to be. Maybe I misspoke, and it would seem like too trite a comparison, in which case I'd stand corrected. So thank you for that. What I'm speaking to more is the ease with which people become complicit without taking moral responsibility for what their actions are. Those who this notion that everyone, if you're going to resist, you're going to face a concentration camp, you're going to be shot yourself. This itself becomes a kind of mythologizing aspect of the Holocaust as well. There's a great big difference between forming an active resistance to Nazism and refusing to do certain actions or certain jobs. There isn't a single record of anyone refusing to kill Jews, any German soldier or policeman or member of the SS refusing to kill Jews and being killed themselves or sent to a concentration camp. They were simply given other tasks, other roles. Okay. Far less so.
That is absolutely true. I think that is absolutely 100% true. but that wouldn't apply to a Pole who refused to do something under request from a Nazi officer. But what you say is absolutely right.
You're right. It's the importance of context, right? Sure.
Okay, I've got two more questions I want to shoehorn in. So, Rachel, I'm sorry, you can't duck this one because it's for you. And you'll be honoured to know that it's from Sir Nicholas Winton's daughter, Barbara. Hello, Barbara, and thanks for passing your question. And this is the question: how possible is it to teach aspects of Holocaust history which are less favourable to the British government when you are government funded?
Thank you for the question, Barbara. It's always lovely to hear from you. It's a really valuable question, and I think it's worth pointing out that even though we are mostly government funded, we are not solely government funded. So that's a recent development, and it makes a little bit of difference. The other point to add is that we were instigated by the government. They set us up, and that's why they fund us. But they set us up to do the work for them. We run Holocaust Memorial Day. We are an independent charity, and that gives us some opportunity to teach what we think is the most appropriate thing to teach. And as I mentioned before, we make sure that everything we talk about is grounded in historical context. So we make sure that it is factually based. So I hope that answers the question a little bit. We do follow government guidelines on certain things, but we also have an element of independence.
Thank you. Okay. I'm just conscious of time. So one final question. Again, whoever wants to answer this, actually, because everyone's well placed to answer it. It's from Barbara Christian, who asks, what do you consider the most dominant of Britain's myths about the Holocaust? Good question. Maybe dominant in the sense of what effect it has in the real world today.
My best guess would be a lack of understanding of contemporary anti-Semitisms in Britain in the 30s and the 40s, and how that affected government policy, most often, I think, indirectly, of worries of what the population would accept. And, you know, there are all kinds of things we could point to: the terrible crushing in the East End, the underground, which was blamed on Jewish people, and a kind of that kind of rather posh upper class anti-Semitism that ran through the establishment.
Yes,
which interesting. Yeah, that's right. But which interestingly, Churchill didn't subscribe to, and was regarded as being a bit eccentric because of his pro-Jewish views.
Yeah. Final word from you, Paul, on it? Question mark?
It's a really good question. I think not necessarily the most dominant of the myths, but I think an important one. The way in which potentially we frame British history through the Holocaust, when we're looking at mass atrocity, when we're looking at genocide, when we're looking at great crimes of suffering, the Holocaust is an important one for us to confront, and because it's the most extensively documented, best understood example, it's a very good place for us to understand this kind of phenomena. On the other hand, it's also, for a number of reasons, become maybe an example which is rather comforting for Britain to look at. And there are also other crimes, other dark aspects of our national past, which I think we have to be careful not to allow the Holocaust to become a kind of screen memory to those. So we also need to confront the crimes that this country was involved in through imperialism, through colonialism, and the continuing and ongoing consequences of those. So I think the Holocaust is absolutely, and my career has been focused very much on the history and education around the Holocaust, but I don't think it shouldn't be the only one that we look at. Lord Pickles and Rachel both spoke to other genocides as well, and the importance of looking at those. I think I'd expand that out a little bit further, and also want to look at some aspects of Britain's own dark parts of its past and its role in the world.
Well, I feel the second series coming on, so before we let it brew any further, I better call it a day. So listen, Paul, Rachel, Lord Pickles, thank you very, very much for coming on and giving us your time. You've been very generous, particularly as it's overrun by half an hour. I'm sorry to you out there watching if you have a question, we didn't get time to answer it, but your time is probably rumbling for dinner. So again, to everybody watching, thank you very much. And to my three guests, a huge thank you. And I look forward to carrying on discussing all these issues and doing something about it in the months and years to follow. From me and from the National Holocaust Museum, it's good night. It's the end of the series. And we will be making, if you're interested, any of these three-part series that we've been running in the past 6 months available on demand. So look at the website if you're interested in that. For now, thank you again and good night.
Good night.